Here we are, folks, back with Eye on the Illini. It's football season. Illinois coming off their first victory of the year, beating the team they were supposed to, Eastern Illinois. And of course, up comes Kansas, the team that really, to be honest, as somebody who was sitting up in the press box, they filleted the Illini last year. And if Lance Leipold wasn't such a nice man, this could have been a much, much larger score, but it stayed fairly manageable on the scoreboard, although at no point was Illinois in any danger of winning that game. But to help us out, we're testing our luck here. Henry Greenstein is back with his evaluation of this Kansas team to help us understand. And last time, you were really nice about it. That was a game that we were all surprised by from the Illinois side. Henry, how do you look at this Kansas team? I know Lindenwood is hardly a great measuring stick, and Illinois played Eastern Illinois, which is very similar, not a great measuring stick. How do you feel overall the Jayhawks are coming into this game?
Well, first of all, a quick note on last year's game. I just thought it was interesting today to hear Brett Bielema kind of talk about how KU moving the game to Friday night and drumming up excitement for it really worked in their favor for that one. And I wonder if there'll be any sort of reciprocal effect this time around for Illinois. And certainly KU is a team that hasn't had a huge amount of success on the road over the years, so that could play into it. But yeah, this year's KU team looks a lot like last year's KU team. You know, a great deal of returning experience. Not too many huge additions through the portal, not too many freshmen contributing right away. Next year is when things are going to get really interesting because they have 30 seniors. But, you know, if you're an Illinois fan and you watched last year's game, you'll recognize a lot of the names. And possibly the most important one that Illinois did get to see last year, but not many others actually did, was Jalen Daniels, who is now back and healthy. And maybe he'll be able to unleash some form of what he did on Illinois last year when he was running all over the place, juking out Johnny Newton in the end zone and finding people downfield. You know, we saw just the barest shell of what Jalen Daniels might be able to do against Lindenwood. But you're right, it's not a very accurate measuring stick for KU, especially with a new offensive coordinator. Jeff Grimes has been very particular about how he's answered our questions so far this season. He doesn't want to give teams any real sense of just how much he might be diverging from what Andy Kotelnicki did beforehand. And this game is going to be the first time to really see Jeff Grimes' stamp on the offense.
Maybe to go a little bit sideways here before we get started, but on my Heat Checks and Hail Marys podcast, I really take a look at what Drew Aller, how much better he looked after one game. Now, granted, we all have to go, it's just one game, but they were playing West Virginia, not Eastern Illinois. And Drew Aller had his best game statistically as a quarterback. I'm wondering, with what he did with Jalen Daniels, if you've got a guy who has been trained so well by Leipold, and then you can turn up the offense at a Penn State. If I'm an athletic director, I look at this guy and I say, he's got everything we need. And he's even a recruiting coordinator. So it's not like that is beyond him either. He could be the next big thing in college football.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why he went to Penn State, is just both to show he could do it without Lance and also to get a sense of what a program would look like without Lance. And it's funny, watching the Penn State, that's like the most I've ever heard an offensive coordinator talked about on a college football broadcast, but for good reason. I mean, you can see his imprint right away on a team, even only one game in. You know, not just all the silly packages with Bo Pribula and stuff they were doing, but the way he uses motion to disorient a defense and scheme people open was on full display. And the question was kind of whether that would work for Drew Aller, who's not like a mobile option guy the way Jalen Daniels and Jason Bean are. And one game in, early returns are quite positive, and I wouldn't blame anyone for looking at him as a head coaching candidate. Now, I do think, I'm not sure he has the strongest recruiting resume. I don't think he recruited too many guys to KU who ended up contributing, and really not that many numerically overall. But in terms of the scheme stuff, there aren't many doing it like him.
Drew Aller is a good player, don't get me wrong, and he has potential, which is a French word that means you haven't done doo-doo yet. All of a sudden, all those what ifs and what he could do and what he should do for 4 quarters, he was doing those things. And if they can continue that, and who knows, we know that in college football, there's a lot of first game wonders, but boy, if he can continue, that team's going to be a lot tougher than people think. Andy's put himself in a position where there may be a really big pot of gold at the end of that rainbow.
I agree with you completely. This I didn't really have much confidence in Penn State heading into this season. I was really interested to see how they'd handle the test of going into Morgantown and dealing with a place that isn't easy to play and a team that has dynamic running backs and a lot of high expectations for this year. And they passed that test with flying colors. So certainly going to be interesting to see. And I think a lot of people in Lawrence will be following over the course of the year. Just interested to see how Kotelnicki continues to translate his system and what kind of wrinkles he adds with the players he's got up there.
Yeah. Let's step back then. So Illinois, the fans are a little nervous because Kansas comes in ranked in the top 25. They've certainly earned it. And one wonders, had Jalen Daniels been healthy all year last year, just how good that team might have been. As the Jayhawks come into Champaign, what is this offense going to do, in your opinion, to attack the Illinois defense?
Yeah, well, I think one way in which they succeeded last year was by establishing the run and their physicality really early on. I think it probably took Illinois by surprise, as KU is not a team that was really known for that. So I'm going to be looking to see how the kind of rebuilt KU offensive line handles itself against the rebuilt Illinois defensive line. Illinois is kind of using a mixture of program guys and transfers, maybe more transfers than program guys on the defensive line. And I think it's kind of the reverse with KU, where they brought in Bryce Foster, the center from Texas A&M. He eventually earned the starting job. This is a guy who was once a freshman All-American, is assessed by The Athletic. He's going to have a lot of pressure on him in this game to clear those holes and get Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw going in the early stages of the game. And if there's anyone who can clear holes, it'll be him. He's 6'5", 330 pounds, throws a shot put. Just like a unique athlete, the kind Kansas has not had for many, many years. But where things are going to be really interesting for me is at the tackle position, because Bryce Cabledew, who has played right tackle for his entire career, has been switched over to left. And I'm just not sure exactly how he's going to be able to handle like a serious edge rush presence. I don't know if Illinois is a team that will provide that, but certainly they have some accomplished players in that respect. But he and Logan Brown switch sides, and I think that's just an under the radar storyline to follow. So if they get rattled early on, that could be a problem. But yeah, I think it's important for KU to set the run game in order right away, because you don't want Jalen Daniels. Last week Lance Leipold said he had a talk with Jalen Daniels, like, you can't get 14 points on a single play. You can't make up for missing 9 games in one game. I think there is a possibility that if they don't establish the run game early, Daniels could be tempted to try to do too much in his first real big game back. I think that they need to take pressure off of him, even though he's a veteran, even though he's been in games like this before. I think they need to do everything they can to not make the game rest on Jalen Daniels' shoulders. He's best when he's like elevating the game state beyond what it was previously. And then just find ways to get the ball out in space in the perimeter. They got a lot of guys who can do that, including some guys that maybe fly under the radar, like Trevor Wilson, the number 4 wide receiver. Just find, I guess, new and exciting ways to test those Illini defenders on the outside. I think that those are the things they got to do early, because all of that will go toward reducing the impact of the crowd and playing on the road. And, like Lance Leipold said today, KU really hasn't established a record of being able to beat power conference teams on the road in non-conference play. They beat Houston in 2022, but I believe that's the only one in the Leipold era. And of course, Houston's now in the Big 12 anyway. So it'll be an interesting test of this offense under Jeff Grimes. I don't think anyone really knows what it's going to look like. He has said repeatedly he's not here to reinvent the wheel, that he came under the acknowledgement they were going to retain a lot of what was being done before. But this is a guy who likes jet sweeps and screens and under center stuff far more than Andy Kotelnicki. So expect to see all that at some point on Saturday.
That makes it a little bit unpredictable, although Again, Illinois struggled with some of that. They do have a nice presence on the outside with Gabe Yakus and
Yeah.
Seth Coleman. So they've got something that may cause some issues. Defensive backfield played well, but they played well against Eastern. And again, I don't want to knock the accomplishment of shutting out a team and scoring over 40, but it's not like playing Kansas on the road. How important is this game to Kansas? But is this a game they get up for, or is this one that they've got to try to manufacture some enthusiasm for?
Well, I will say I don't think this game has quite the same season-determining potential that it did last year. I think last year this game was an opportunity for KU to determine, like, to inform the world that it was a real program worthy of being taken seriously, which to some extent it did. Um, I don't think this one is quite the same litmus test. I do think that because of all that senior leadership I mentioned earlier, I think those guys will ensure that KU is motivated for this game. I think they'll ensure that they see it as the challenge that it is, and throw themselves entirely into it. I think with the playoff format being what it is now, there's an argument to be made that non-conference games like this maybe have their importance diminished somewhat, because if you're in a power conference, you can be the conference champion and have lost a random game at Illinois earlier in the season. That being said, I think a loss here would certainly set off some alarm bells about just how serious of a contender this team actually is if they can't beat a team that was picked 13th in the Big Ten. With KU having aspirations to make it to the Big 12 championship game, they were picked fourth in the Big 12 in the preseason poll. So it is a litmus test to some extent, but I think not maybe to the same, like I said, program defining almost degree that I felt it was at this time last season. And I'm not really sure from the Illinois perspective exactly how that holds up. I think that certainly Illinois will probably want to indicate that the season's going to be on a more positive trajectory than last year's was. And I feel like you were there, so you may correct me on this, but I feel like the KU game may have been a sign of things to come for Illinois over the course of
Oh,
the
yes, it was. And I will tell you, my colleague Matt Stevens, who you met last year as well, he is saying that this is the most important game in the Brett Bielema era
Wow.
because you need to show the fans, in particular, that you are moving forward. And last year, Illinois did run into issues where they lost to first-year coaches in the Big Ten, on top of losing to Kansas, with Lance being allegedly the other person who was in the running for the Illinois job. Now we can take that with a grain of salt. That's always going to be hard to pin people down on. But Brett Bielema wants to show that his program is moving forward, and there would be no better way to do that than to prove to everyone that they can beat a team that literally took them to the woodshed and took them apart last year. I don't tend to think it's quite that much, but I do think Illinois needs a good showing. If they lose in similar fashion, then I think that does put a little bit of a hex on the team. And worse is the Illinois fans who showed up for it, and they're close to a sellout. The Illinois fans who show up for it, all of a sudden now the rest of the games, it's like, what are we going to do here if we're getting blown out? So I think it probably is much more important to the Illini than it is to Kansas overall for a lot of the reasons that you outlined.
Yeah, a bit of a reversal. Yeah.
Yeah, the running game of Kansas is problematic. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that was a part that I think Jalen Daniels gets a lot of the headlines. And then you watch how good Neal and company are, and you're like, somebody should be writing more stories about these guys.
Yeah. Devin Neal may be the team's best player, and a lot of ink gets spilled on him here in Lawrence because he's from Lawrence, went to Lawrence High School, and committed to this program when Les Miles was still the coach, and I really just came into a kind of hopeless situation. And he's been as much of an architect of this transition as anyone. But on the field, I think Aaron Henry said something today about how he can like squeeze into the smallest of holes and you can't leave any space for him or something. And that's a really good description of it. He's extremely elusive. He's really good at making the first cut. When he gets to the outside, he has a certain level of breakaway speed. Not like a burner necessarily, but he can find another gear. And then Highshaw is a great compliment. You don't hear about him too much. He faded a little bit down the stretch last season compared to what he was doing in games like Illinois and UCF, but he's a power guy. He'll run you over. He's compact, got a low center of gravity. And the thing is, I mean, those guys will get by far the most carries, but there are a couple other guys in the room who are worth knowing about. Savion Morrison, who started his career at Nebraska, has been injured for a lot of that career, but he's extremely elusive as well. They want to get him on the outside. They want to line him up in the slot and find interesting ways to get him the ball. And it'll just kind of be interesting to see how you balance fitting that in without detracting from the fact that the lion's share of carries need to go to Devin Neal. Neal is now at this point, let's see, he was 765. He's now 653 yards away from becoming KU's all-time leading rusher. So that should give some sense of the impact he's made on this program. And yeah, going to be a tremendous challenge even for Illinois' veteran linebackers and whatnot to deal with him in this game.
And at the wide receiver position, how loaded is Kansas? One would think that going there to play with Jalen Daniels would be a real wouldn't be the hardest sell in the world.
You know, what's interesting about that is all these guys came in the same class as Jalen Daniels. KU really has not had any turnover in its wide receiving class for the last 3 to 4 years. It's been the same guys, Lawrence Arnold, Luke Grimm, and Quentin Skinner, basically since 2022 and in some cases 2021. And a result of that, they have a really good rapport with Daniels. They all have their own different skill sets, but Luke Grimm seems to have really taken a step forward. I think that his connection with Daniels is just on a level, on a level certainly beyond what his connection with Jason Bean was, and I think beyond maybe Daniels with any other wide receiver. He had 100 yards in the opener against Lindenwood. He looks quicker than ever before. He's slipperier than ever before. He's always been a good route runner. I think he's maybe a guy to watch for sure. And then Lawrence Arnold, more of your conventional kind of NFL-bodied, like red zone threat sort of guy. And then Quentin Skinner's a deep threat who can burn you over the top, although he struggled a little bit against Lindenwood. He had a fumble on a end around. So those are the three guys to watch out for. Again, a very deep position group, but I mean, what you're saying makes sense. You'd think this would be a place where people would come in to get the chance to play with Jalen Daniels, but because there's been so much continuity, there really haven't been openings for guys to do that.
Daniels, to his credit, spread the ball around last year. He had completions to 9 different receivers, and that was for 277 yards. And then Devin Neal led the way, but they ended up with 262 yards of rushing for Kansas. So there really wasn't much good to talk about the Illini other than the fact that the score didn't double and go from 28-7 at the half to 56-14. But it was also fairly clear that Kansas was not going to be caught in the second half.
Yeah, I think that's true, although I think there is maybe a bit of a sense in the Kansas camp here that they let their foot off the gas too much in that second half. And if they do that again, they'll pay the price.
Let's be rooting for that. Illini fans are in too fragile of a place. We don't need to see another one of repeats of last year. Now, in terms of tight end positions, is there anybody there that Illini fans need to be focused on?
Yeah, this is kind of a weird one, just because, Mason Fairchild was the guy last season. I don't think he did a huge amount in the Illinois game, but he had a knack for getting open and certainly a guy that Coach Mickey liked to scheme into all sorts of interesting places. But he's gone to the NFL now. He's on the Saints practice squad now. And the guy they brought in the offseason, Deshaun Hanukkah, suffered a long-term leg injury in spring, and I don't think he's likely to come back anytime soon. So that has kind of left KU in an odd position where the next guy in line who's sort of the prototypical tight end in terms of physical makeup and attributes, Trevor Cardell, hasn't quite seized the opportunity of being a number one guy. Kansas's number one tight end is Jared Casey. And if that name's familiar, it's because he caught the game-winning two-point conversion when they beat Texas in 2021. But he was a walk-on fullback then, and he's still built like a fullback. He's slimmed down a little bit, but he's 6 feet tall and like kind of heavier than your average tight end too. And Jeff Grimes basically said Jared is by far their best tight end, and they're going to just kind of rework the offense in ways to take advantage of his skills. But he's been known to make all sorts of big catches over the years, not just that Texas one. He had a game-sealing catch on third down last year at Iowa State. a really reliable guy, but far from your prototypical tight end. I guess he presents some matchup problems for sure, but there's no one at that position I would say who's like a guy you circle when you're game planning
Yeah.
necessarily.
So basically, what you're telling us is the offense that was so deadly is pretty much almost all back together. A little bit of tweaks on the offensive line. So let's look at the other side of the ball. The defense of Kansas was where I was most surprised last year. They were supposed to be not particularly good, and they played with a high degree of intensity, and they hit hard and they hit first. Did Illinois catch them just on their best day, or is that what their identity is, and that's what Illinois fans can expect out of this Kansas defense?
Well, certainly I think that was one of their better days last season. I mean, there were days where the defense didn't look nearly as good, but I will say on the whole, they went from being, one of the worst defenses in the country in a lot of metrics to a solidly middling, maybe even at times above average defense, which is really, I recall saying with you this time last year, like if they can just be fine, the offense will take KU where it needs to go, and that's basically what happened. But this year's defense is a little bit different. There are some familiar names for sure. I think probably maybe just because he has the name he does, but I think Kobe Bryant might be the player on KU with the most name recognition nationally, besides maybe Jalen Daniels. And he's kind of like the prototypical guy you'd want as your top corner. He's like super confident and loud and locks people down. He rarely gets thrown at. On the other side, they got Mello Dotson, who may be just as good of a player, but he's much quieter. One of those guys who was his play talking, and he's now the KU career leader for pick sixes. And all three of those have come in the last 10 months. He had one against Oklahoma October 28th, one against Iowa State the next week, and one against Lindenwood last week. So the top two corners are really kind of the core of KU's defense this year. The thing is, and the safeties are good too. They got couple of really experienced turning guys in Marvin Grant and OJ Burrows. The thing is, can KU avoid putting too much pressure on them to cover indefinitely? And can KU actually get after the quarterback? Last year against Illinois, I seem to recall, was one of the games where it first started to become clear that Austin Booker was going to be a thing. And he ended up becoming so much of a thing that he left early and became a 5th-round pick of the Chicago Bears. No one really saw that coming when he transferred from Minnesota, not really having played at all in his first 2 years there. Now the question is, who will replace Austin Booker? And there's some very encouraging signs with Dean Miller, who is a former JUCO guy out of College of the Canyons, who kind of just toiled in obscurity for the last couple of years on special teams because he couldn't get up to the weight he needed in order to play defensive end. But this offseason really committed to putting on. He's up to 235 pounds. He's incredibly athletic and has great fast twitch reflexes and all that, and got his first career sack against Lindenwood. Now, of course, going up against JC Davis is going to be an entirely different matter. So this will be the first kind of indication as to whether Dean Miller is a legitimate pass rush threat. The other side of the defensive end group is very experienced and good, with Jeremy Robinson, Youngstown State transfer Dylan Woodkey, and then third is Ron McGee, who had an ACL injury last year. So strong side defensive end, very solid. Defensive tackle also quite solid. A lot of experienced guys there, although one offseason breakout star, Caleb Taylor, is injured. Weak side defensive end has been one of the biggest question marks of the offseason, just because it's basically Dean Miller and then a bunch of freshmen who haven't really shown anything. Well, they haven't shown anything because they haven't gotten the chance to, because they just came from high school. So that'll be a matchup I keep my eye on for sure.
How about the linebacker position? Again, they were flying to the ball last year, so it was like a swarm of angry bees for the whole first half.
Yeah, I think the linebacker group may be even better this year, even though it's not quite as deep maybe, but I think that the guy, Cornell Wheeler, is the new middle linebacker, and he's even been named a captain without having really ever started for KU, and he seems like in a lot of ways he could be an upgrade over last season. And then J.B. Brown, who was prominent in that Illinois game last year, is a very hard-hitting weak side linebacker. He's still around. He's only gotten better. He's gotten a better sense of his place in the defense and just an understanding of the scheme and all that. KU plays a lot of 4-2-5. Basically, their third linebacker is what they call a hawk, and it's a sort of linebacker safety hybrid thing. And so when they're in their base defense, it'll be played by a guy who has some mix of those skill sets. But more and more, what they've been doing is when the other team has three wide receivers, they will have a safety, Marvin Grant, play what is then known as the Cinco position, which is what the Hawk turns into against nickel. And then they also have a true nickel, which in those cases, they'll move Kobe Bryant inside and have him be the nickel corner and put Demarius McGee on the outside. So that position is kind of in constant flux. So last year, they had a guy, Craig Young, who was so versatile in terms of skill set that he could sort of do at least those first two things. Now there's a lot more substituting that goes on. So something to watch there, because I don't think that, I mean, Marvin Grant's a very good player, but no one in that group has the same kind of overall skill set that Craig Young did.
Yeah, so you hit the defensive backs there. What are your expectations out of this defense this year? The offense has to have expectations that are sky high based on the number of returnees and then the talent level. You just have to have a trigger man in football. I don't care if you're playing peewee football. You need to have a good quarterback. Jalen Daniels, good quarterback. What are the expectations for how close the defense can protect the offense, so to speak, by stopping scoring?
I think that it will be about as good as it was last year. I think it has a chance to be better. There are three areas that defensive coordinator Brian Borland pinpointed for improvement. Number one of them was against the run. And in the early days of last season, that manifested itself a lot as specifically dealing with running quarterbacks. I mean, you may have recall from last year that Luke Altmaier was by far the leading rusher for Illinois in that game, but that wasn't a one-time that wasn't a one-time thing. KU had opposing quarterbacks as leading rushers in his first three games, but then as the year drew on, it kind of became clear that they were struggling against a lot of teams' running backs too. I mean, Oklahoma, they ended up getting an upset in that game, but they kind of got shredded at times by Tawi Walker in that one. And there were a few games where they were exceptional. Like against BYU, I think they allowed 9 rushing yards or something, but defending the run, one area. Number two, third down. KU was not a good third down team last year, particularly in third and long. I have confidence that's an area where they can get better just because I think those cornerbacks on the outside are so solid. But again, that will depend a little bit on their ability to get a pass rush. And number three, and to me, this is the most apparent thing, KU actually, I believe, statistically had the worst red zone defense in the country last year. They allowed teams to get into the red zone 50 times, and the opposing team scored 49 of those times. And the only one that didn't was Oklahoma, and they were only on the 20-yard line anyway. So they almost literally did not stop anyone when they got into the red zone. And I'll be keeping an eye on that for sure going forward, because at some point they have to force a turnover in these close quarters, and that can be the kind of play that changes a game. And if they do that, I mean, when you think about the fact that they were a pretty average defense last year and they were dead last in that category, you just imagine that if they improve that a little bit, they have a chance to actually be one of the better defenses in the conference.
This game will tell quite a bit for KU fans than what they have from the defensive side. Illinois' offense is probably this year. We'll have to see, because Bielema has a way of turning average defenses into really good defenses, along obviously with his defensive coordinators. But on paper, the offense looks much better than the defense this year, with the offensive line that's a little deeper than it was last year. The wide receiver room is missing 2 guys who are now playing on Sundays, but there is plenty of physical talent there. And then the running back room is huge. McCray at 238, and then you've got Fagan at 253. These guys are just ginormous, and they're fast. There seems like there should be an opportunity there, but whether Illinois can make that happen in front of the lights on FS1 against a top 20 team, that's what's to be determined. From a special team standpoint, how is the punting game for Kansas?
Yeah, the punting game, I mean, it sort of does exactly what it sets out to do, which is prevent people from returning punts. I think last year KU maybe didn't allow a punt return or something like that. But the downside of that is that Damon Greaves, who is one of the many Australian punters in college football, has a pretty low net average. He was in the high 30s, I think, for net last year. He did not punt in the game against Lindenwood, which is, I guess, not a huge surprise. But so this will be his season debut. So that's kind of interesting. And then one other interesting note about Greaves is that he is listed as the starting holder on the depth chart, but with the new place kicker Tabor Allen, who I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. Graydon Addison, the backup punter, has still been holding as he did last year. Someone told me today that there's different holders assigned to different kickers at KU, maybe, and that's why. But just a little detail I thought was interesting, because that was basically the only way in which KU actually deviated from the depth chart that it gave us last week, was in terms of who was the holder.
How is the kicking?
Yeah, so there was a kicker battle. KU does not have a kicker on scholarship as far as I know, and there was a three-way battle going through all of spring and into fall camp. Really, the kicking game has let KU down quite a bit in recent years. Last year was not as bad as the prior one, where the kicker was like 7 for 13, but last year was still not ideal. There was a point midway through the year where the kicker just kind of stopped being able to get extra points over the line, and that kind of was one of the main reasons why KU lost at Oklahoma State last year in a really important game. And then it kind of became a weird thing where Leipold was switching back and forth between two guys and has just said he doesn't want to do that. So what ended up happening was that the guy who was the kickoff specialist, Tabor Allen, has now also won the place kicker job. In the first game against Lindenwood, he made all but one extra point, but hitting an extra point off the upright in your first game as a starter does not necessarily inspire confidence. I'm not sure whose fault that was. It could have been a hold or snap thing. But yeah, I mean, he hasn't had to attempt a field goal yet. And so you're going to be doing that on the road at a Big Ten team for your first college kick. And it's just, I don't know, this whole position has given me an uneasy feeling, because it's three extremely inexperienced guys with one combined field goal attempt between them in college. And the one they chose, apparently he was on a tear through the latter stages of fall camp. But it's one of those things where you just kind of say, I'll believe it when I see it. And I think if you're KU, you don't want that to be in a super clutch situation.
The special teams may be an area that Illinois has a little bit of a advantage. Is there any intangibles you see this game, or is this just going to be one where we line it up and see who wants it more? Anything we've missed in terms of previewing this for Illinois fans?
Well, I feel like I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I feel like Illinois has a certain element of vengeance on its side. I heard Bielma say today this is the first of 6 rematches they have, and they were 1-5 against those opponents last year. And I think that there's a certain kind of, let's get revenge, let's protect our house sort of deal to this that might give Illinois a little bit of a mental edge. And that's why I think it will be a challenge for KU seniors to match the level of intensity that I personally expect Illinois to bring. KU is not used to being a road favorite. I think that's only happened like a couple times since the Mangino era. And they are a favorite at this juncture. And at the same time, though, I do think that the veteran leadership I mentioned, the continuity level that KU has is, at least to my eyes, more than Illinois has. And I think that could give them a little bit of an edge, especially at this early juncture in the season.
Yeah. So how is the recruiting going? Because as an outsider, I look at it and I see all these older players. Are there guys that are pushing their way that next year's not going to be a rebuilding year, or is next year going to be a year that it's like, hey, we got to get some money together and hit the portal because things haven't went as well recruiting wise as we'd like?
Well, I think that even if this were the greatest recruiting class in program history, there's just such a sheer number of needs that KU will have that you will have to hit the portal in a way that KU never has. They've gotten a select few guys from the portal whenever they can, but 30 seniors is crazy, especially when you look at a group like wide receiver, where there's like the top 4 guys are all going to be gone. So you're going to be relying on Doug Emelian, who has like 10 career catches, and Keaton Kubeka, who's a redshirt freshman, as like your top 2 guys. They're going to have to go hard in the portal at that position. The freshman recruiting for next year, I would say, has been solid, if not as spectacular as last year's. I think like this current freshman class that's starting now has players like DJ Warner, who is a pass rush defensive end who was courted by the likes of Ohio State and Michigan and Washington last year, ended up sticking with a commitment to KU. And that's testament to KU's former defensive backs coach, Jordan Peterson, who really kind of created a pipeline in Arizona from which KU got a few of its top players in this class. I don't think this next class has a a Deshaun Warner in it. Deshaun DJ, he goes by both. I
Yeah.
don't think next class has a DJ Warner in it. Um, I think one area that KU still is not getting very much traction is the kind of in-state and regional recruiting. It's invested a lot of time in guys who have simply gone elsewhere. These are still people who grew up with KU being, frankly, a laughing stock, and it's kind of hard to get them away from that idea. So I think next year will have such a wide possible array of outcomes. I mean, for one thing, Jalen Daniels still has another year of eligibility. Like, I don't know if he'll come back. If you had to ask me now if he was going to, I'd probably say no. Assuming he is healthy and has a good season, he'll probably go to the pros. But that's a massive level of uncertainty. And you talk about people wanting to play with him. If he's not there, I think it's going to be significantly harder for KU to attract high-end talent. So yeah, the future is very uncertain, which makes the season, it lends it a whole kind of high stakes air that I don't know that any other KU season has had for quite a while.
And then one final question on this is Jalen Daniels, is he being looked at by the NFL, or how is he perceived from what you guys can tell?
I'm not sure really. I think he probably is seen as something of an enigma just because he's played one season's worth of games over the last 2 years. But I mean, when you see him play as you did, it's pretty exceptional the things he's able to do outside the pocket, the way he can deliver even on some off-platform stuff. He's got a really good feel for the game in the quarterback spot. I think that his professional prospect ultimately depend on him being able to put together a full season and look good while doing it.
Now we come to the part of the show that everybody loves the most. What's your prediction for the score this week?
Yeah, I mean I feel like I cited some areas where I feel Illinois has an edge, but I've kind of been saying KU by a touchdown for a while, so I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to say 31-24. So I feel like this is one that'll be in doubt until the latest moments of the game, though I think it'll be very different from last year. I think KU may even have to lead a game-winning drive, and that's where I feel like that veteran stability may win out for them. That's just how I've been feeling up until this point. I know the spread right now is at 5.5 points or so. But yeah, that's just the feeling I get out of this. I think KU, I think it reminds me a little bit of last year's game at Iowa State. I think they now have the ability to win on the road when maybe they didn't before. I think that KU's defensive tackles and linebackers will be able to deal with those big running backs, at least to a reasonable extent. And I think they'll show some improvement over last year's run defense. Overall, I feel pretty good about KU's chances.
Okay. So Illini fans, we're a little bit nervous now after listening to Henry talk about this team coming to town, but there's a reason why they're ranked in the top 25. And of course, Brett Bielema is going to do his best to knock them out of it and see exactly where Illini can get their first big win of the season. So if you enjoyed listening to Henry here, you can find him at Henry and then Green and then STEIN, all one word, no underscores, no anything. And also the sports editor at LJ World. So you can find his stuff there as well. Really appreciate you coming on. And of course, maybe we'll have another bout sometime. Kansas and Illinois probably have a nice shot of running into each other, maybe in the Elite Eight or Final Four.
Yeah, you never know what might happen, but it is always a pleasure, Mike. So I appreciate you having me.
And now that I think about it, there's one final question I had to ask you.
Sure.
So, how excited are you and people at Kansas about the possibility of UConn coming into the Big 12? Because the Big 12 has a fantastic basketball conference. If you throw UConn into it, you could argue it's the best basketball conference in the country. How is that playing with Bill Self and Kansas folks to see that happen?
You know, weirdly, there just hasn't been as much discussion of it locally as you'd think, especially compared to the first time around when it was floated. But yeah, I think that'll be a storyline heading into basketball season. I mean, for my part, I think it totally seems like the sort of thing Brett Yormark would do at this point. He's developed a reputation for these kind of big swings with no real. And this is what conference realignment is now. There's regional footprint plays basically no role in these decisions. And Yormark has shown that he thinks basketball is a good bet for the future and that the media deals will continue to provide value. And getting a story program like UConn, I mean, just imagine the inventory they'd be able to offer to networks on a weekly basis, games at Gamble and all that. So, I mean, I'd certainly be excited to see it come to fruition. I think I haven't really heard too much about what they might do in terms of a partner. I think that having an odd number of teams is just not ideal. But yeah, it's something I'm going to be looking forward to following more as basketball approaches because really haven't gotten to get too much local reaction on it so far.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thanks so much for listening. Of course, thanks to Henry for coming on. It was a lot of fun talking with him. He is a sports writer, and you can tell how much care he takes in what he says and thinks about it, trying to measure his words properly. The total opposite of me. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, of course, you can go to IlliniGuys.com, 27 cents a day. We'll get you a membership. You can get everything there first. You can get all the stories. You can go out onto our message boards where you can interact with other Illini fans or Matt or Ked or Brad or Larry or even myself. Sometimes there'll be Illini legends out there as well. They sometimes hang out. That's always a lot of fun. And we want to make sure we create a community where Illini fans have a great time. We also talk a lot of Big Ten and a lot of sports in general. So if you need a few minutes to get away from the headlines and just enjoy things, we only do sports and guy stuff like movies, etc. at IlliniGuys.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you. Until next time, go Illini.